This is a review of the 1981 Georges Lautner film, The Professionnel, or as it's known in French, The Professionnel, but more difficult to pronounce. This movie stars the late and the iconic Jean-Paul Belmondo, and I guess I'm doing this review partly as a tribute to Belmondo, who died earlier this week. He was one of the most iconic French actors of all time, known to generations. Of course, there are many obituaries of him. You've probably already read one. It's told you that, Breathless was his most famous film and such. So I'll skip over the basic biography and talk a little bit about this interesting and also iconic film, The Professionnel. So I first became aware of this movie a long time ago because I was a big fan of Ennio Morricone, and Ennio Morricone did the music for this film. There's two songs in particular that he wrote that are in this film. I think only one of them was actually written for this movie. The other one was written about a decade earlier. One of them is called Chi Mai, and the other one is Le Vent le Cri. I probably mispronounced both of those. But when I was first sort of watching spaghetti westerns when I was much younger, and first becoming aware of Morricone as this legendary and incredible composer, these were two of the songs that I stumbled onto. I think they're maybe not as well known as his work for some of the westerns. Some sort of sleeper hits from Morricone. Of course, they're a lot better known than the scores for the vast majority of his work, given that he scored, over 400 films, I think, most of which many people have not seen or listened to. But these songs stuck out to me. I think I learned how to play one of them on the piano, but it never really occurred to me to watch the movie for a couple of reasons. I think the main one is that it just seemed like it was going to be dated, and partly that's because these songs, these pieces are a little bit dated, not in the melody. The melody is great, has sort of a melancholic feel, classic sort of Morricone sound, but the orchestration of the melody, the arrangement, is a bit dated. It has some sort of big reverby 80s drums in it. I guess I just got the feeling that these probably came from a bit of an 80s movie. Seemed a bit dated. Doesn't seem like the classic sort of score from some of Morricone's other work, even some of his work that's newer, like his work for Once Upon a Time in America or something like that. So anyway, I also watched the trailer, so I didn't base this entirely off of the score, but I watched the trailer as well, and I remember thinking at the time that it looked kind of tacky, over-the-top violence with extremely red, oversaturated blood and sort of tacky acting, secret agent catchline sort of thing, uncompelling, dated genre film. And one of the questions I go into this movie with, one of the things that defined my viewing of it was, is it a tacky, dated genre film? And the answer is mostly yes. I think this is still a good movie to cover as a tribute to Belmondo, however, because this captures him at his largest, perhaps. Some of the most vivid images of Belmondo come here, some iconic things. And if you want a feeling of his essence, this is one way to get it. Is he as good in this as he is in something like Breathless? Well, I don't think so. But like I said, this is perhaps Belmondo at his largest. So let's start from the beginning, because instantly we get some sort of interesting things. For one thing, the opening credits to this movie are perhaps a little bit polarizing. They start out with the score, great score, and you don't even hear the 80s drums in the beginning, so you might not even be aware. And in some ways, I think the opening credits are kind of stylish and fitting. In other ways, they seem kind of gaudy and over the top. So just some interesting visual effects, messing with the color of the images and such. Lots of still frames or sort of repeated short clips of Belmondo doing things. And in some ways, they really are pretty stylish. But in other ways, the title sort of spins into place and such, and it is kind of tacky. It is an interesting question of comparing something like this to some of the typography that you might see in a movie like Contempt or one of Godard's other films that have sort of really stylish, snappy typography and opening credits. Usually this kind of has that, but also feels like it's from the 80s. And that kind of thing, I think, more or less sums up this movie, where, yes, it does fall back into being dated quite a bit, but it also has some pretty snappy, fresh, stylish pieces. Right after the opening credits, you come to one of the most intellectually interesting parts of this movie, kind of smacks you in the face. And that's the specter of colonialism. So this is an iconically French movie, but it does not begin in France. It begins in an imaginary African country called Malagasy or something like that. And from the get-go, basically, there is a conspicuous presence of colonialism here. France obviously has sort of a fraught colonial history. And in the beginning, it seems like this movie's not really going to come out on the right side of things, not going to do a very good job of addressing that. If anything, it seems that the African characters in the movie are sort of manipulative, scheming, corrupt government officials who are manipulating Belmondo and who are maybe by proxy manipulating the French public more generally into some sort of empathy play for African countries or something like that. Ultimately, it seems like maybe the African countries are in some ways corrupting the French. In the beginning, that's the impression that you get, which was a bit off-putting when I first started watching the movie. I thought, yikes. But I'm not going to spoil much from the movie. I will say, though, that as the film goes on, the moral of the story shifts somewhat. And I think what the film really is saying more about colonialism is more along the lines of it being a total mess. As you learn more about why Belmondo was in this country, whatever it's called, and the position of the government towards that, and as you see how the characters talk about politics and about the government and about colonialism and such, and about Africa, you start to realize that this movie is far from some endorsement or some normalization of colonialism, much more towards indifference at best, but probably derision towards some of those policies, perhaps wasted time, wasted resources that compromise the ethics, the integrity, the time and relationships of the French. That said, the African characters in this movie still are far from complex, and they're far from positive. So very weak, regressive, stereotypical, dated characters that play a role throughout the movie. They're not as much in the forefront of the movie. You know, in the beginning, they're really at the forefront. Later on, not so much, but they're still there, and it's still a bit of an issue. So like I said, in some ways, kind of a snappy movie, but also very dated. So I'm gonna try not to spoil anything, but I will mention that Belmondo does not spend the entire film in this made-up African country. He makes it back to France at one point, one way or another, where he starts sort of coming back to life in some ways. He starts reuniting in some ways with some people that he knew in the past. He bumps into a lot of vivid characters. There's Rosen, Farge, and Valera are all extremely vivid characters, and you can see why this movie is iconic in some ways. Just by watching it as an outsider, you can see why people would have watched this and it would have caught on, why the characters would have stuck with them, why they would have stayed in their heads. For some of the supporting characters, this is a combination between sort of cartoonish almost traits and compelling storylines, I think, in some ways, where the characters are in some ways goofy, in some ways kind of over the top, in some ways laughable, right? Laughable is memorable in some ways. But in other ways, they do have moments of intensity. They do have moments of violence. They do have moments where they get the best. They do have moments where they pour salt into the wounds of the characters and of the viewer. They also have moments where they are bested. And that kind of a play, that sort of exchange of power between vivid characters, I think is one of the things that makes this memorable. But surely the most memorable thing about this movie is, of course, Belmondo himself. And like I said, if you want an iconic performance, this is it. At least this is one. In some ways, there are maybe moments where the film sort of trips over its own iconic nature or something like that. There's a lot of money shots in this film, for instance. There's a lot of Belmondo saying something snappy and then beating people up or something like that. And sometimes this borders a little bit on the ridiculous. In a lot of places, it more or less works. It's an action movie, and it more or less works. But there are a couple of times where he's maybe just a little bit too cool. Things are just a little bit too easy. And he's just he spends a little bit too much time talking to the camera and not doing the thing you would think he'd be doing, like fighting the bad guys or something like that. That said, I should mention as well that, Belmondo, definitely sort of a suave, powerful, cool character in this movie, but there's some other aspects to him as well. There's a grit to him. You see that in Breathless as well. There's also an indifference to him. These things seemingly make him this iconic French character. And like I said, the movie definitely delivers on that front. There are some other supporting characters in the film that are not quite as good. If you want a movie that is sort of the textbook definition of the objectification of women, look no further than The Professional. The roles for women in this movie are truly dreadful, both in sort of a moral perspective. The women in this film really are nothing more than eye candy, and not in some subtle way, not in some cheeky way, but the film fully commits to essentially their exploitation. Not ideal. There are also just ways in which the characters are weak, don't make much sense. For example, there's a character in the film named Alice, and very poorly sort of written character. Belmondo's wife as well, very poorly written character. They're not given a chance to speak and to specify exactly how they feel about the position or about the situation, about what's going on. It's unclear where their allegiances lie at a fundamental level. There's some high-level things in the plot where most characters are aligned one way or the other, where the women are just kind of silent, and that's makes it kind of hard to follow. They essentially do not exist as characters in the plot, basically. And it's no mystery as to why. It's no mystery as to what the purpose of women in this film is. But like I said, not only is it sort of morally fraught and off-putting, but it also kind of completely screws up the narrative when it comes to those characters, because they just really aren't a part of it. And their role and their allegiances just don't really make very much sense. This could be a completely off-putting for most people. I would completely understand. It was pretty off-putting for me. So like I said, the movie, it is dated in a lot of ways. This is an action movie. It's a espionage thriller kind of thing. It has a pretty decent plot. It has some clever moments. Belmondo has some clever tricks. I wouldn't say that the overarching plot is particularly brilliantly conceived, but there are clever tricks in it, essentially. That's sort of one of the best parts of it. And there are a number of fairly powerful scenes. For instance, the scene with Roseanne and Belmondo's wife there's a lot of energy in that scene. That's a very charged scene. And there's a number of places like that where things are very charged and sort of energetic, sort of suspenseful scenes, very well shot, very crisply put together. Like I said, there are also some moments that are a little bit of a farce. Overall, the plot is not rigorously considered in this movie. Just about every turn of events that happens, just about every twist that you see, if you took a minute to sort of sit down and think about it, you would have a lot of questions about why people didn't notice X, Y, and Z, or why they didn't try this other option, or, man, they sure got lucky that this thing happened as opposed to something else happening. It doesn't sink the movie, but it is somewhat noticeable, I would say. This movie, in a lot of ways, you might compare it to a James Bond film, and I think that in some ways I would take this movie over some James Bond films, maybe over many James Bond films, although I would say that some of the Bond of the 80s with Roger Moore are some of my favorite James Bond films, not because they're good movies, but because they're extreme movies. I would pick this over a number of those sorts of films. Action in it is pretty good. There's a pretty good car chase. For instance, the blood is quite red. The music in it is nice. Some iconic characters, some vivid characters, some tense scenes, some clever twists. And there's one element, too, that it has that James Bond doesn't really have, except occasionally, which is this sort of downcast and melancholic vibe. Like I said, I picked up on this when I was first listening to the score. And what is the origin? What is the root of the melancholia? I'm not 100% sure. Are we tying this into colonialism again? I don't know. Is this sort of an essentially French kind of thing, sort of the existentialist espionage, to some extent, a tinge of the depressive or something like that? Something along those lines, maybe. We have this in this movie, and with that, I think that we get just a little bit more complexity in some ways than we get in terms of James Bond as a character. Belmondo's character maybe has just another dimension or something like that. Like I said, I watched this movie and I'm reviewing it, I guess, as a tribute to Belmondo, and so my goal isn't to say that this is, dated, horrible movie or anything, and it's not a bad movie, but it is fairly dated at times. But I'd reiterate that Belmondo is great in this. And if you want to see what he was about and why he was iconic, watch this movie. You can see how that boils down. So that's The Professional from 1981. Like I said, it's an okay movie. I would sort of recommend it.